The Yom Kippur War broke out in October 1973, and Israel did not lose because it was blind. It lost its footing because it could see, and still failed to move. Egyptian and Syrian forces struck while Israeli intelligence held warnings in its hands, while radar screens kept talking, while the system kept calculating that an attack didn't make sense. How does a state built on early warning end up surprised anyway? Why does a military that trusts technology and readiness decide, in effect, to treat visible danger as manageable noise? And what happens when rational analysis becomes a shield against action? This is not a story about a secret trick. It is a story about a strategy of exposure, where what is visible becomes the perfect hiding place. The strategic problem of this episode is simple to state, and brutal to live through. Israel's security doctrine depended on time. Time to mobilize reserves. Time to move armor. Time to concentrate air power. Time, above all, to prevent a small country from being forced into a war of reaction. And yet, in the opening phase of the Yom Kippur War, that time collapsed. Not because Israel lacked sensors. Not because it lacked intelligence collection. Not because it lacked competent officers. The collapse happened because the system treated information as proof of control. Because it assumed that if it could see the threat, it could manage the threat. And because it believed the enemy would not choose a war they could not decisively win. That is the unorthodox core of what we are dissecting, a form of strategic concealment that does not rely on secrecy. It relies on visibility. Exposed to conceal is not a poetic phrase here. It is a mechanism. When a leadership culture becomes confident in its models, it can start using transparency, its own readiness, its own surveillance, its own constant monitoring, as psychological armor. The enemy's preparation is not denied. It is observed. Then it is explained away. Then it is absorbed into routine. Then it becomes safe. And that is where the trap forms. A normal commander, facing repeated warning signs, has a basic reflex: assume the worst, act early, accept the cost of false alarms. Israel could not afford endless false alarms, politically, economically, socially. Mobilization disrupts a nation. It drains legitimacy. It creates fatigue. It also creates a dangerous precedent: once you mobilize and nothing happens, you train your own system to doubt itself next time. So the decision pressure tightens into a narrow corridor. If you mobilize and you are wrong, you pay a visible price. If you do not mobilize and you are wrong, you pay an existential price. And the most seductive option becomes the one that feels irresponsible in the moment: trust the assessment, trust the pattern, trust the model. This episode is not about blaming individuals. It is about dissecting a system that produced a specific kind of confidence so stable it became a blindfold. Because the enemy did something that strategic models tend to dismiss. They did not need to prove they could win the entire war. They needed to prove Israel could be hurt. They needed to break a political and psychological equilibrium. They needed to force Israel into a war that Israel did not choose, at a time Israel did not control. That kind of war does not begin with tactical genius. It begins with understanding how an opponent interprets reality. So the strategy we are analyzing is not a clean plan with a single author. It is the emergent outcome of assumptions that hardened into doctrine: the belief that technological superiority creates strategic predictability, the belief that intelligence clarity reduces uncertainty, the belief that rational enemies avoid irrational wars. And when those beliefs become a filter, the enemy's most dangerous weapon is not deception in the classic sense. It is their willingness to act outside the logic you expect. In the next sections, we will not walk through a battlefield timeline. We will reconstruct the strategic architecture that made surprise possible in a system designed to prevent it. We will dissect how visibility becomes camouflage, how warning becomes noise, how success from the past becomes a prison, and how the cost is paid, first in hours, then in lives, then in political shock, and finally in a long-term scar that reshapes doctrine. Because the disturbing lesson of Yom Kippur is not that Israel failed to know. It is that Israel failed to believe what it already knew, until the war made disbelief impossible. And once you see how the disbelief was manufactured, the next question becomes unavoidable: who benefits when a warning is visible, and still ignored? To understand why visibility became a liability, we have to reconstruct the strategic landscape as Israeli decision-makers perceived it before the first shot was fired. Not the battlefield itself, but the structure of constraints pressing on every choice. Israel was facing two coordinated adversaries, Egypt and Syria, operating on separate fronts but bound by a shared political objective. Their immediate military goals were limited. Their strategic ambition was not annihilation. It was rupture. Rupture of deterrence, rupture of psychological dominance, rupture of a regional balance that had frozen since 1967. For Israel, the problem was geometry and time. The country lacked strategic depth. Its army relied on reserves. Mobilization was not a technical step, it was a national event. Factories slowed. Civilian life paused. International attention sharpened. Every mobilization carried political cost, diplomatic risk, and internal fatigue. Mobilize too often, and the system trains itself to doubt the next alarm. Mobilize too late, and there is no margin to recover. This was not a battlefield dilemma. It was a systemic one. On paper, Israel appeared strong. Air superiority was assumed. Armored maneuver was the core doctrine. Intelligence collection was dense, layered, and technologically advanced for its time. Early warning was not a luxury, it was the foundation of national survival. The assumption was simple and deeply ingrained: if Israel had time, Israel would win. Therefore, any enemy contemplating war would first need to neutralize Israel's early warning advantage. And that, according to Israeli analysis, was beyond their capability. This assumption quietly redefined what counted as danger. Preparations by Egypt and Syria were observed. Movements were tracked. Exercises were logged. Signals accumulated. But each signal was filtered through a prior belief: rational adversaries do not start wars they cannot decisively win. Therefore, what was visible had to mean something other than imminent attack. It had to be pressure, signaling, political maneuvering, or posturing for negotiation leverage. Visibility became reassurance. The constraints reinforced this logic. Israel could not strike preemptively without political consequences. The memory of 1967 loomed large, not only as a military success but as a diplomatic burden. Any move that looked like aggression risked isolation. Waiting, by contrast, could be justified as restraint. Restraint sounded responsible. Restraint preserved legitimacy. Restraint aligned with the image Israel wanted to project as a state acting rationally under constant threat. There was also the problem of repetition. Alerts had occurred before. Each time, mobilization had followed. Each time, war had not. The system learned from this. Not formally, but psychologically. Warnings that do not culminate in catastrophe slowly erode their own authority. Analysts begin to search for reasons why this warning, too, will not cross the threshold. Leaders begin to weigh not only the cost of being wrong about danger, but the cost of acting on danger that never materializes. Over time, the burden of proof shifts. Instead of asking, "Is there enough evidence to ignore this?" the system asks, "Is there enough evidence to justify disruption?" Egypt and Syria operated inside this mental environment. They did not need to hide completely. They needed to behave in ways that could be interpreted as non-decisive. Preparations framed as exercises. Movements explained as defensive. Signals that remained ambiguous enough to sit inside Israeli models without breaking them. This was not classic deception aimed at creating a false picture. It was something subtler, allowing the real picture to exist, but ensuring it remained compatible with the enemy's expectations. From Israel's perspective, the enemy faced obvious limitations. Crossing fortified lines would be costly. Holding territory under Israeli counterattack seemed implausible. Air defenses were improving, but not assumed sufficient. Logistics favored Israel in a prolonged fight. All of this reinforced a single conclusion: if war came, it would come only after a dramatic shift in the balance of capabilities. Until then, visible preparation was not proof of intent. It was proof of constraint. This is where the strategic landscape turns hostile to intuition. Because the enemy did not need to solve Israel's entire problem set. They needed to exploit Israel's dependence on time. If they could compress the decision window, even briefly, the structural advantages Israel relied on would become liabilities. Reserves cannot mobilize instantly. Air superiority takes time to assert under surprise conditions. Political consensus lags behind shock. The first hours matter more than the first victories. The Israeli system, however, treated those first hours as manageable because it believed they would never be conceded. Early warning was assumed to function as a buffer, not as a point of failure. The possibility that warning could exist without triggering action was not fully internalized as a risk. It was seen as an administrative or political problem, not a strategic one. This is why the battlefield itself is almost secondary at this stage. The decisive terrain was cognitive. The lines that mattered were not trenches or canals, but thresholds: the threshold for mobilization, the threshold for believing intent, the threshold for acting without perfect certainty. Each threshold had been raised incrementally by past experience, institutional confidence, and fear of unnecessary escalation. Egyptian and Syrian planners understood something crucial. They did not need Israel to misunderstand the situation completely. They needed Israel to understand it just well enough to hesitate. They needed clarity without urgency. They needed visibility without alarm. And they needed the Israeli system to do what complex, successful systems often do under stress: default to the model that has worked before. The strategic landscape, then, was not defined by ignorance. It was defined by overinterpretation. By a belief that the system could always buy itself a little more time to be sure. By confidence that rational calculation would prevail on both sides. And by a quiet assumption that history would repeat itself, because the logic behind it seemed sound. But history does not repeat itself because logic demands it. It repeats when assumptions go unchallenged. And inside those constraints, inside that architecture of confidence and delay, a move that should have been impossible became viable. Not because it was hidden, but because it was visible and still discounted. And it is precisely at that point, when every normal option feels constrained, that a decision forms which no doctrine officially authorizes, but which the system drifts into anyway. Military doctrine exists to remove hesitation. It compresses experience into rules so commanders do not have to reinvent judgment under pressure. In Israel's case, doctrine after 1967 was brutally clear: prevent surprise, strike early if necessary, and never allow the opening phase of a war to unfold on the enemy's terms. The assumption was not subtle. If indicators crossed a certain threshold, mobilization and preemption were not options. They were obligations. Under a normal doctrinal response, the situation in October 1973 should have triggered immediate action. Large-scale enemy movements. Forward deployments. Elevated readiness on two fronts. Even without perfect certainty, doctrine favors early disruption over late reaction. A conventional commander, trained on worst-case planning, would argue that the cost of unnecessary mobilization is finite, while the cost of being surprised is unbounded. The textbook answer is therefore simple: act early, absorb political fallout later. But doctrine does not operate in a vacuum. It operates inside institutions, memories, and incentives. And in this case, doctrine collided with a deeper belief system that quietly overrode it. The first fracture point was the interpretation of intent. Israeli doctrine assumed that warning signs were meaningful only if they aligned with a plausible enemy objective. Intelligence indicators were not evaluated in isolation. They were weighed against a strategic model that defined what the enemy could rationally want. War, in that model, was an instrument to achieve decisive outcomes. Since Egypt and Syria were assessed as incapable of achieving decisive victory, the conclusion followed: they would not choose war. Doctrine said, prepare. The model said, they won't. This created a dangerous hierarchy. Doctrine became conditional. Intelligence became subordinate not to facts, but to interpretation. Signals that contradicted the model were explained away as noise. Signals that fit the model were elevated as confirmation. This is not incompetence. It is how mature analytical systems behave when they trust their frameworks too much. The doctrine did not disappear. It was suspended pending better alignment with expectation. The second fracture point was political cost. Israeli doctrine assumed freedom of action in the early phase of conflict. But after 1967, that freedom narrowed. Preemption now carried diplomatic consequences that doctrine had not been designed to manage. Mobilization became a visible political act, not just a military precaution. Each call-up signaled intent. Each false alarm weakened credibility. The doctrine that demanded early action did not provide guidance on how to balance repeated mobilizations against long-term political legitimacy. So commanders faced a dilemma doctrine never resolves cleanly. Follow the book, risk political isolation and internal exhaustion. Or delay, preserve legitimacy, and trust that warning time still exists. The more often the second option worked in the past, the more reasonable it felt in the present. The third fracture point was technological confidence. Israeli doctrine placed enormous faith in early warning systems. Sensors, intercepts, surveillance, analysis, these were not supporting tools. They were foundational. Over time, early warning stopped being seen as a fragile advantage that could fail, and became an assumed constant. Doctrine implicitly treated warning as guaranteed, not contingent. As a result, the idea that warning could arrive and still not trigger action was not fully conceptualized as a risk. This is where the doctrinal logic collapses inward. If warning is guaranteed, then reaction can always be delayed slightly to gain clarity. If clarity is always coming, urgency diminishes. The doctrine that once demanded speed begins to tolerate delay. Not openly, not deliberately, but through accumulated habits of success. Each hour without catastrophe reinforces the belief that the system is still in control. A fourth problem emerges here: doctrine is designed for symmetrical logic. It assumes the enemy is trying to win in the same way you define winning. But the Egyptian and Syrian objectives in 1973 were not aligned with Israeli expectations. They did not need to destroy Israel militarily. They needed to break a psychological and political stalemate. They needed to prove that the post-1967 order was not permanent. That objective does not require doctrinal perfection. It requires timing. Under classic doctrine, a limited offensive that cannot be sustained appears irrational. Under a political strategic lens, it can be entirely rational. Doctrine, however, struggles with opponents who accept high cost for limited gain. It struggles even more when those opponents are willing to risk failure to force strategic movement. Israeli planners understood this in abstract terms. But understanding something abstractly is not the same as internalizing it operationally. The dominant mental model still framed war as a test of capability, not a test of will. As long as Israeli superiority remained intact, war seemed unlikely. Doctrine did not account for the possibility that superiority itself could provoke an attack designed to erode its psychological value. The result was paralysis by plausibility. Each doctrinal trigger was evaluated not on its own terms, but against a broader narrative of rational behavior. The doctrine said, act. The narrative said, this does not add up. And because the narrative had been correct before, it carried more weight than the rulebook. This is why it is misleading to say doctrine failed because it was ignored. It failed because it was selectively applied. The parts that aligned with institutional confidence were retained. The parts that demanded disruptive action were softened. Doctrine became a reference, not a command. And once that happens, it loses its ability to cut through uncertainty. The most uncomfortable implication is this: the Israeli leadership was not reckless. It was cautious. And that caution, shaped by success, created conditions in which a doctrinally unthinkable scenario could unfold. War began not because doctrine was wrong, but because doctrine was no longer trusted to operate without confirmation from a model that could not imagine the enemy acting outside its logic. This is the core contradiction. Doctrine exists to prepare for unlikely events. But the more successful a system becomes, the more it starts treating unlikely events as impossible. At that point, doctrine stops protecting against surprise and starts explaining it away. By the time this contradiction became visible, it was already too late to resolve cleanly. The window in which doctrine could have asserted itself had closed. What remained was reaction under pressure, not prevention by design. And once doctrine stops dictating action and starts negotiating with belief, the next step is inevitable: a decision that looks cautious, feels responsible, and quietly abandons the very assumptions doctrine was built to defend. By the time the decisive choice emerged, it did not look like a dramatic break from doctrine. It looked incremental. It looked administrative. It looked like risk management. That is what makes it dangerous. No single meeting produced a declaration that Israel would accept surprise. No single commander proposed in explicit terms that warning could be tolerated without action. What formed instead was a convergence of pressures that slowly narrowed the range of acceptable moves until inaction became the least disruptive option. The first thing to understand is that this was not a clash between bold innovators and conservative traditionalists. It was a debate among professionals operating inside the same conceptual frame. Everyone agreed on the fundamentals: early warning mattered, mobilization was critical, and surprise would be catastrophic. The disagreement lay in timing, thresholds, and credibility. When exactly does preparation become intent? When does caution become paralysis? And who bears responsibility if the alarm proves false? Within the Israeli system, intelligence assessment held extraordinary weight. Not because generals abdicated responsibility, but because intelligence had earned trust through repeated accuracy. That trust hardened into authority. When analysts assessed that enemy movements did not yet indicate an unavoidable attack, their judgment functioned as a brake on action. Commanders could override it, but doing so meant assuming political and institutional risk. Acting against the assessment was not framed as decisiveness. It was framed as panic. This dynamic reshaped internal debate. The question was no longer, what if they attack, but what if we mobilize again and they do not? That question carried real consequences. Each unnecessary mobilization strained the economy, exhausted reserves, and signaled instability to allies. The leadership was acutely aware that credibility is consumed, not stored. Use it too often, and it loses force when you truly need it. Here the unorthodox logic begins to crystallize. The system starts treating visible preparation as something that can be monitored rather than interrupted. Surveillance becomes a substitute for action. If enemy forces are visible, then their behavior can be tracked. If they can be tracked, then any escalation should be detectable in time to respond. This is the critical assumption, that warning is not a binary state, but a gradient that can always be escalated later. That assumption feels reasonable. It is also fragile, because it rests on three core premises. First, that the enemy will cross a clear threshold before attacking. Second, that detection of that threshold will be immediate and unambiguous. Third, that reaction time after detection will still be sufficient to prevent strategic shock. None of these premises are guaranteed. All of them are vulnerable to manipulation. The enemy does not need to hide if they can blur thresholds. They do not need to deceive if they can normalize preparation. They do not need to race mobilization if they can compress the window in which mobilization matters. And they do not need to defeat Israeli forces outright if they can force them to fight from a position of reaction rather than choice. Inside the Israeli leadership, this logic was not fully articulated, but it was implicitly accepted. Preparation without concealment was interpreted as a lack of urgency. Urgency was associated with secrecy, speed, and anomalous behavior. When the enemy prepared openly, methodically, and in ways that resembled previous exercises, the psychological trigger for emergency action failed to fire. There was also a deeper psychological factor at work: responsibility diffusion. No single actor owned the decision to delay. Intelligence assessed. Commanders monitored. Political leaders weighed consequences. Each layer deferred slightly to the next. In such systems, catastrophic outcomes rarely stem from one wrong call. They emerge from many reasonable ones, each justified in isolation. The unorthodox decision, then, was not a conscious embrace of exposure. It was an acceptance of exposure as manageable. Visibility was reframed as stability. The absence of concealment was treated as evidence of constraint. And constraint was equated with predictability. This is the moment where, exposed to conceal, stops being metaphorical. The enemy's openness did not conceal forces or movements. It concealed intent. More precisely, it concealed urgency. By remaining visible, the enemy allowed Israeli planners to believe they were still ahead of the curve. That belief reduced the perceived need to disrupt the status quo. Crucially, this was not ignorance of risk. It was a calculation that risk could be absorbed later. The leadership believed that even if war came, Israel would recover quickly. Air power would assert itself. Armor would counterattack. Reserves would arrive. The opening blow would hurt, but not decide the war. This belief lowered the perceived cost of delay. It transformed early warning from a survival requirement into a performance enhancer. Once that transformation occurs, the strategic posture shifts. Instead of preventing surprise at all costs, the system begins to manage surprise. It assumes it can survive an initial shock. That assumption is rarely stated explicitly, because stating it would reveal how much is being wagered. But it shapes behavior all the same. Opposition to this posture existed. There were voices urging caution, urging earlier mobilization, urging disruption. But those voices faced a high bar. They had to argue not only that the enemy might attack, but that the existing model was wrong. Challenging the model meant challenging the foundation of recent success. That is an uncomfortable position in any institution, especially one built on survival narratives. So the decision space narrowed. Action became extraordinary. Delay became normal. The system drifted toward a posture where everything was visible, everything was monitored, and nothing was triggered. Exposure became routine. Routine became reassurance. This is the unorthodox heart of the strategy. Not a bold deception plan, but a collective belief that openness neutralizes danger. That if nothing is hidden, nothing decisive can happen without warning. And that if warning arrives, there will still be time. That belief was not irrational. It was coherent. It was internally consistent. And it was catastrophically sensitive to one variable it could not control: the enemy's willingness to accept limited gains at high cost. Once that willingness was misjudged, the logic collapsed instantly. But until that moment, it felt stable. It felt professional. It felt responsible. And that is why the next phase is so revealing, because it shows what happens when a strategy designed to manage risk is suddenly forced to confront the fact that risk has already matured into reality. Once war began, the consequences of the earlier posture became immediately visible, and this is where the strategy reveals its true mechanics. What had been treated as a manageable delay turned into a compressed crisis. Mobilization did not fail, but it arrived under fire. Air power was not absent, but it was forced to respond rather than shape events. Command and control did not collapse, but it operated in a reactive mode that Israeli doctrine had always treated as dangerous. The first operational effect was temporal shock. Units that were meant to arrive before contact now moved during contact. Decisions that were supposed to be made with hours of deliberation were made in minutes, sometimes seconds. The system had assumed it would always have one more layer of warning. Instead, it discovered that warning without action is functionally identical to no warning at all. The difference is psychological rather than procedural. Leaders were not confused about what was happening. They were shocked by how fast the consequences of earlier restraint materialized. From a logistical perspective, the cost of exposure became acute. Reserve mobilization under fire is not simply slower, it is messier. Transportation networks clog. Commanders receive incomplete unit strength. Equipment arrives out of sequence. This does not paralyze an army, but it degrades its early coherence. The Israeli system had been optimized to move from readiness to dominance quickly. Forced to move from surprise to stabilization, it bled time and confidence simultaneously. Air power illustrates the problem clearly. Israeli planning assumed that air superiority would assert itself early and decisively. But early air operations were now burdened by urgent defensive tasks, unexpected threats, and the need to compensate for ground units caught in unfavorable positions. The Air Force was still powerful, but power used to recover equilibrium is different from power used to impose it. The distinction matters, because the psychological effect of dominance depends on timing. When dominance arrives late, it reassures your own forces but no longer shocks the enemy. This is where the exposed to conceal dynamic shows its most dangerous feature. By treating exposure as a form of control, the system accepted a narrow margin of error without fully acknowledging it. When that margin vanished, the strategy did not fail cleanly. It failed unevenly. Some sectors held. Others bent. A few came dangerously close to collapse. The system absorbed the blow, but only because individuals compensated at extreme cost. Risk, in this phase, was no longer abstract. It was measured in specific vulnerabilities. Fuel convoys moving under threat. Armor advancing without full situational awareness. Infantry holding lines that had never been meant to exist. These were not signs of incompetence. They were signs of a system forced to improvise because its timing assumptions had been violated. There were also moments when the strategy nearly broke entirely. Points at which a slightly different enemy decision, a slightly faster exploitation, or a slightly slower Israeli response could have produced outcomes far worse than those recorded. These near failures are rarely emphasized in retrospective narratives because they undermine the comfort of eventual recovery. But they are central to understanding the cost of the earlier gamble. The strategy did not simply risk defeat. It risked loss of control. What is striking is how quickly the Israeli leadership shifted once the reality was undeniable. Mobilization accelerated. Political constraints loosened. Decisions that had been delayed for fear of escalation were now executed under duress. This rapid shift exposes the core flaw in the earlier posture. The leadership was capable of decisive action, but only after certainty replaced probability. The system required proof, not indication. And by the time proof arrived, the price of action had multiplied. From the enemy's perspective, the execution phase validated their approach. They did not need to sustain momentum indefinitely. They needed to survive long enough for the strategic effect to register. The early days mattered more than territorial permanence. Each hour that Israeli forces fought reactively rather than proactively reinforced the psychological rupture the offensive was designed to create. Even as Israeli countermeasures intensified, the initial shock had already done its work. Internally, the Israeli command structure now faced a second-order crisis: trust. Trust in assessments. Trust in assumptions. Trust in the processes that had delayed action. This erosion of confidence does not show up on maps, but it shapes decisions. Commanders become more cautious, or more aggressive, depending on temperament. Coordination becomes harder when everyone knows that the system failed them once already. Recovery requires not only material reorganization, but cognitive recalibration. It is important to note that none of this implies inevitability. The strategy of exposure did not guarantee disaster. It guaranteed vulnerability. And vulnerability is only decisive when exploited. The fact that Israel eventually stabilized the situation does not negate how close the margin was in the opening phase. Survival should not be confused with validation. The execution phase therefore forces a reframing of what worked and what did not. If the objective of the enemy was to shatter the assumption of Israeli invulnerability and force strategic movement, then the early phase achieved disproportionate effect. If the objective of Israeli restraint was to avoid unnecessary escalation while preserving decisive advantage, then the cost of that restraint must be measured not against total defeat, but against the price paid to regain initiative. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the strategy. It did not collapse because it was foolish. It collapsed because it relied on a timing buffer that no longer existed once the enemy accepted risk Israel believed they would avoid. The strategy functioned exactly as designed until the moment its core assumption was violated. After that, it did not gradually degrade. It snapped. The lesson here is not that exposure is always dangerous. It is that exposure without a clear action trigger converts strategic risk into operational debt. That debt can be serviced if the shock is limited. It becomes catastrophic if the shock is sharp. Israel managed to pay it down, but at a cost far higher than the system had calculated. And this leads directly to the most revealing part of the story, because the final judgment of this strategy cannot be made without understanding how the enemy interpreted Israeli behavior, and where their own miscalculations intersected with Israeli assumptions. Because only by examining how the opponent reacted, and where they reacted wrongly, can we understand whether this was a near disaster narrowly avoided, or a warning about how modern systems fail when they trust themselves too much. The success and failure of the opening phase cannot be understood without stepping into the opponent's logic, because the strategy of exposure only works if both sides misjudge different things at the same time. Egypt and Syria did not simply exploit Israeli hesitation. They also operated under constraints, assumptions, and limits that shaped how far they were willing to go once surprise was achieved. From their perspective, Israeli behavior before the war was not reassuring. It was puzzling. Israel saw the buildup. Israel did not mobilize fully. Israel did not strike preemptively. To Egyptian and Syrian planners, this could mean one of two things. Either Israel was complacent, or Israel was deliberately holding back, waiting for a clearer justification to respond with overwhelming force. Both interpretations carried risk. And this ambiguity shaped how aggressively the offensive was exploited. The initial reaction validated the enemy's core hypothesis: Israel could be caught off balance even with full visibility. Early advances succeeded not because Israeli forces were weak, but because they were positioned for a different kind of war. Defensive lines were thinner than planned. Response time was longer than expected. Command cohesion lagged in critical sectors. For Egypt and Syria, this confirmed that the psychological barrier of deterrence had cracked. The shock itself became proof of concept. But here the enemy made their own critical assumption. They believed that achieving limited objectives would be enough. That once the initial blow landed, Israel would be forced into political negotiation under pressure, or at least lose its aura of inevitability. This belief constrained their exploitation. They did not uniformly push to collapse Israeli command structures. They did not universally accept the risk required to convert early success into decisive operational breakthroughs. This is where the symmetry of miscalculation emerges. Israel assumed the enemy would not accept a war they could not win outright. The enemy assumed Israel would not absorb early losses and still escalate effectively. Both assumptions were partially wrong. And the war's trajectory was shaped by the overlap between those errors. Enemy command structures also faced friction. Coordination between fronts was imperfect. Logistical sustainability under counter-pressure was uncertain. Air defenses provided protection but not freedom of maneuver. Every additional kilometer advanced increased vulnerability to Israeli recovery. So while surprise worked, momentum was fragile. The enemy achieved disruption, but not dominance. Crucially, Israeli restraint before the war had a paradoxical effect on enemy perception. Because Israel had not reacted early, the enemy could not be certain whether the lack of response signaled weakness or calculation. That uncertainty made them cautious at the moment when maximal aggression might have paid the highest dividends. Exposure had concealed Israeli thresholds, but it also concealed Israeli red lines. As Israeli mobilization accelerated and countermeasures intensified, the window began to close. The enemy now faced a choice: escalate further and risk catastrophic reversal, or consolidate gains and preserve the political effect already achieved. In choosing consolidation, they effectively accepted that the opening shock was the main strategic payload. They had forced Israel into war on unfavorable terms. They had demonstrated vulnerability. They had altered the narrative. That was enough. From a narrow operational perspective, this restraint limited the damage Israel suffered. From a strategic perspective, it locked in the war's meaning. The conflict was no longer about who held which position, but about the collapse of an assumption that had governed the region since 1967. Israeli superiority remained real, but it was no longer unquestioned. The enemy did not need to defeat Israel. They needed to force Israel to doubt itself. This dual misreading is essential to the analysis. The Israeli system overestimated its buffer. The enemy underestimated Israel's capacity to recover once fully committed. The war became a collision between delayed reaction and limited exploitation. Neither side achieved everything it might have if its assumptions had been fully aligned with reality. What matters for our purpose is this: the strategy of exposure succeeded not because it was perfectly executed, but because it interacted with an opponent willing to accept partial success. If the enemy had been prepared to gamble everything, the outcome could have been far worse for Israel. If Israel had acted earlier, the enemy's gamble might have failed outright. The actual result sits between those extremes, shaped by hesitation on both sides. This is why the strategy cannot be evaluated as either brilliance or blunder in isolation. It was a system-level interaction. Exposure reduced Israeli urgency. Israeli restraint reduced enemy certainty. Surprise worked, but exploitation was cautious. Recovery followed, but at a cost. Each move constrained the next. The most dangerous takeaway is not that Israel misread its opponent, or that the opponent misread Israel. It is that both sides operated with incomplete models of each other's risk tolerance. And when war is initiated to break a psychological equilibrium rather than to achieve immediate victory, those models matter more than force ratios. The enemy reacted correctly to Israeli delay by attacking. They reacted incorrectly to Israeli recovery by limiting escalation. Israel reacted incorrectly to visible preparation by delaying mobilization. It reacted correctly to shock by committing fully. The war's shape is the sum of these asymmetries. And that leaves the final, unavoidable question. If both sides were wrong in different ways, what ultimately decided the outcome was not doctrine, technology, or deception alone. It was how much risk each side was willing to absorb before recalibrating. Which brings us to the cost of that recalibration, because whatever strategic lessons emerged afterward were purchased with losses that no model ever fully accounts for. By the time the fighting stabilized, it became tempting to frame the war through its endpoint rather than its opening. Lines were redrawn. Counteroffensives regained initiative. Diplomatic processes reasserted themselves. From a distance, it was possible to tell a story of recovery, resilience, and eventual advantage. But that framing obscures the central question this episode forces us to confront. Not who held ground at the end, but what was paid to recover what had been assumed secure. The immediate outcome was not collapse. The Israeli state survived intact. Military command regained coherence. Strategic initiative was eventually restored. In conventional terms, this allowed later narratives to emphasize turnaround rather than failure. But strategy is not judged only by whether defeat is avoided. It is judged by how close defeat is allowed to come, and what must be sacrificed to push it back. The human cost was immediate and irreversible. The opening phase extracted casualties at a scale and tempo Israel had not prepared its society to absorb. These losses were not the product of prolonged attrition. They were concentrated, sudden, and psychologically destabilizing. Units that should have been reinforced before contact fought while waiting for orders that had been assumed unnecessary days earlier. The burden fell disproportionately on those positioned along lines that doctrine had treated as buffers, not battlefields. This is the first price of delayed certainty. When warning exists but action does not, the cost is paid by those with the least margin to adapt. The logistical price followed quickly. Emergency mobilization consumes resources inefficiently. Equipment flows become reactive. Maintenance cycles are compressed or ignored. Strategic reserves are spent early, reducing flexibility later. Israel could sustain this because of external support and internal resilience, but sustainment is not the same as efficiency. The system survived, but it did so by burning margin. That margin had taken years to build and was expended in days. Politically, the cost cut deeper than territory. Confidence in leadership fractured. Not because leaders were incompetent, but because they were revealed to be fallible in a way the public had not been asked to imagine. The image of omniscient warning and flawless preparedness dissolved. Investigations followed. Careers ended. Institutions restructured. These are not abstract consequences. They are signals that a strategic narrative has failed. Once broken, such narratives are difficult to repair, because they rest on belief as much as on performance. The psychological cost to decision-makers themselves is harder to measure, but no less real. Knowing that indicators existed, that alternatives were debated, and that delay was chosen creates a lasting internal reckoning. This is not guilt in a moral sense. It is weight. The weight of understanding that restraint, chosen to avoid disruption, enabled shock instead. That weight shapes future decisions long after the immediate crisis passes, often pushing leaders toward overcorrection or rigidity. Strategically, the price was a forced revision of doctrine under duress rather than deliberation. Assumptions that had guided planning were invalidated not by theory, but by blood. Early warning was no longer treated as a sufficient safeguard. Mobilization thresholds were redefined. Trust in models was recalibrated downward. These changes improved resilience, but they came at the cost of learning in the harshest possible way. Strategy that evolves through crisis carries scars that strategy refined in advance does not. It is important to resist the temptation to call this price acceptable simply because the state endured. Survival is not validation. A strategy that exposes a system to existential risk without acknowledging that risk is not neutral simply because catastrophe is avoided. It is dangerous precisely because its failure mode is extreme while its apparent benefits are incremental. From another angle, the outcome also imposed costs on the enemy. Limited success hardened Israeli resolve rather than softening it. Diplomatic leverage emerged, but not without reinforcing Israeli determination to never repeat the conditions that made surprise possible. The psychological effect cut both ways. The war proved Israel could be hurt, but it also proved Israel would absorb pain rather than concede under pressure. This mutual recalibration reshaped regional dynamics for decades. So what are we left with? Not a clean victory, not a simple failure, but a strategic wound. One that healed, but left tissue changed. The war forced Israel to confront a reality it had deferred, that visibility does not equal control, that intelligence does not equal action, and that rational models cannot fully account for opponents willing to accept limited gains at high cost. The most uncomfortable aspect of this price is that much of it was invisible until it was paid. There was no single moment when leaders consciously accepted the risk they were taking. The cost emerged because the system treated uncertainty as manageable, and delay as reversible. When neither assumption held, the bill arrived all at once. This is why the outcome cannot be understood as a redemption arc. Recovery does not erase exposure. Counterattack does not negate surprise. And eventual advantage does not refund lives lost to a strategy that underestimated how fast a misjudged assumption can turn into reality. What the Yom Kippur War ultimately demonstrates is not that Israel chose wrongly at a single decision point. It shows what happens when a system slowly convinces itself that it can always afford to wait one more hour to be sure. And that brings us to the final question this episode must answer: what, exactly, does this strategy teach us about modern warfare, and why does its logic remain dangerously attractive even now? If we strip away the names, the terrain, and the era, the strategy exposed by the Yom Kippur War is not about Israel at all. It is about systems that believe they are managing risk when they are, in fact, accumulating it. What failed here was not intelligence, not courage, not even doctrine in the narrow sense. What failed was a deeper assumption, that visibility reduces danger, and that rational analysis can always buy time. The first principle this case exposes is that early warning is not a shield. It is a trigger. Warning only has value if it forces action. Once a system begins to treat warning as something to be evaluated indefinitely rather than acted upon decisively, it converts a defensive advantage into a psychological trap. Information becomes reassurance. Surveillance becomes sedation. The system feels informed, therefore safe. But safety in war is not a feeling. It is a posture. The second principle is that rationality is not symmetrical. Israeli planning assumed that Egypt and Syria would define success the same way Israel did, through decisive military outcomes. That assumption was wrong. The enemy defined success politically and psychologically. They were willing to trade long-term military vulnerability for short-term strategic rupture. When one side optimizes for survival through control and the other optimizes for disruption through risk, models based on shared rationality collapse. The side that waits for logic to converge is already late. The third principle is that past success is not neutral. Victory reshapes perception. It teaches institutions what works, and more dangerously, what cannot happen. After 1967, Israeli superiority was not just material, it was cognitive. War without Israeli initiative became unthinkable. That belief quietly rewrote thresholds. Actions once considered mandatory became debatable. Delays once seen as dangerous became acceptable. Success did not make the system reckless. It made it confident. And confidence narrowed imagination. This is why the strategy is best described not as deception, but as cognitive exploitation. The enemy did not trick Israeli sensors. They did not blind intelligence. They exploited how the Israeli system processed what it saw. They understood that visibility would not trigger panic, it would trigger analysis. And analysis, under political and institutional pressure, would buy them time. The more visible the preparation, the more it could be framed as non-decisive. Exposure became camouflage. A fourth principle emerges here, and it is deeply uncomfortable. Systems that pride themselves on restraint often underestimate how restraint looks to an adversary. Israeli delay was meant to signal responsibility and control. To the enemy, it also signaled uncertainty. That ambiguity restrained exploitation at the critical moment, but it also made the initial attack possible. Restraint is not inherently stabilizing. It stabilizes only when both sides share the same thresholds for escalation. When they do not, restraint can invite precisely the shock it seeks to avoid. The fifth and final principle concerns decision-making under uncertainty. The Israeli leadership did not ignore risk. They managed it. They debated it. They monitored it. And in doing so, they allowed it to mature. The belief that one more piece of confirmation would arrive before action was required proved fatal to timing. In modern warfare, time is not linear. It collapses. When that happens, decisions deferred for caution are suddenly forced under fire. The cost of delay is not incremental. It is exponential. Taken together, these principles reveal why this strategy remains dangerously attractive today. Modern militaries are even more dependent on information, models, and surveillance than Israel was in 1973. Political constraints are tighter. Mobilization is more disruptive. False alarms are more visible. The temptation to treat warning as something to be managed rather than acted upon has only grown stronger. So has the belief that rational actors will avoid costly, limited wars. History suggests otherwise. The Yom Kippur War does not teach that visibility is bad, or that technology fails, or that restraint is weakness. It teaches that systems must define in advance what warning obligates them to do. Without that definition, information becomes a buffer against action instead of a catalyst for it. And when an adversary understands that dynamic, they can attack not your forces, but your thresholds. This is not a lesson about being more aggressive. It is a lesson about being honest with yourself. About recognizing when confidence has replaced contingency, when models have replaced imagination, and when delay feels responsible only because its consequences have not yet arrived. The most dangerous strategies are not the ones that look reckless. They are the ones that look reasonable right up until the moment they fail.